So as you know, every once in a while, we get to have visitors from outside Annenberg to the Half-Baked Seminar to talk about their work. And today we're lucky to have Robert Strauss, who will be talking about his paper, Student Misconduct and Learning Outcomes, Evidence from Pennsylvania's K-12 Building Records from 1999 to 2018, which you can find on Ed Working Papers. And I'm just going to stick a link to that on there. Whoops, let me add that to the chat so that you can all have that. And just because we don't all know each other, Bob, this seminar takes place every week and is really meant, it's interdisciplinary and meant to help people develop their work. Sometimes it's like this, which is a fully fledged paper, and sometimes it's earlier on, but it's almost always a really nice discussion. But I also want to introduce Bob to the rest of you. Bob was trained in economics at Michigan, go blue, but also at the London School of Economics and the University of Wisconsin. And he started. Yes, no, you can't say that. Sorry, delete that part. He began his academic career at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was an assistant and associate professor of economics and a fellow of the Bush Institute for Child Policy. He then joined the faculty of the School of Urban and Public Affairs, which is now the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon, where he's a professor of economics and public policy. He also served at the US Treasury first as a Brookings Economic Policy Fellow, and then as assistant to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And he served as an economist on the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation for the US Congress. He's received 2 presidential pens in recognition of his contribution to the design, enactment, and renewal of general revenue spend sharing. And while working for Congress, he was also responsible, which is super cool, for the design and enactment of the refundable earned income tax credit, the new jobs tax credit, and the bailout of New York City, which was very good. So really impactful work in practice, as well as through his research and university contributions. He's published widely in theoretical and applied public finance and econometrics, but has also worked in several areas of education policy, which is how I got to know his work well: teacher supply, demand and quality, teacher retirement decisions, and school finance. And I'm so glad that you're able to join us here today.
Well, thank you, Susanna. What she's saying is I'm really old. I have a co-author who's a second-year master's student, Hanlu Zhang, and her job is to correct my mistakes. And so let me start. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm really glad to be among educational researchers, students, doctoral students, faculty, where I can talk about student misconduct and poverty, how they impact learning outcomes. And my slant often in research is to use administrative records in one state. And I hope you've read the working paper, but I gave this talk at Columbia about a month ago, and lo and behold, not many people read it. In fact, nobody did, but that's okay. My job is to try to give you a sense of it, and then Hanlu's going to talk about extensions. Is anybody here a member of the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers? Raise your hand. I don't see anybody. Okay, now there's a reason. Susanna may or may not know about this, but Pennsylvania is a state where teachers have the right to strike. And another sort of component of the way kids, teachers, school board members, and the legislature interact with each other is hardball. And so I've been living with much of this conflict and what I would call benign neglect to my findings in this area. But I have 2 secret members in the audience. One is a TV reporter from Channel 4, which is here in Pittsburgh. And then it turns out, I think I saw David Monk, who Susanna knows, and David actually lives in Pittsburgh now, and longtime Dean of School of Education at Penn State. If you want to know about me, you can go to my website, and if you have anything you want to say privately, just send an email. If you want to know anything about school districts and buildings in Pennsylvania and their teachers and their teacher test scores, go to that website there. That caused Governor Rendell, the Democrat, and his Secretary of Education to get very unhappy with me a long time ago. So don't look at the link now, but it turns out Jennifer's in Pittsburgh, so she could look at that and see how I created an environment where you can compare any building for about a dozen years and see how the kids are doing. I got started in K through 12 education issues when a former student who was CFO of the Pittsburgh Public Schools called me up on behalf of the estranged police chief of that district, suggesting I ask for certain interesting data, which I would get on a CD. Such a phone call was very pregnant, of course, and so I did it, and that got me started on this journey that I'm going to report on today. I want to thank a bunch of students who worked on this over the years: Shelby Cunningham, Rajiv Rutunga, Tessa Hochberg, Natalie, Natasha, and Esther, and also my son, David Strauss, the computer scientist, who under duress would do some programming for me, but now refuses to. And then to some folks I've known who are faculty around the country: Marcus Brilliant, Nogel Gouveia, Dave DeVar, Stuart Knott, who's a attorney with the School Boards Association, and then Julie and Leanna, who Susanna know as well. But this working paper is my doing, and I take responsibility. In earlier work, I found that possession of a knife in a building encouraged at the margin teachers, male teachers, to retire. And knife incidents also impacted adversely on where retired teachers and administrators wanted to return to when they were double dipping. So I found that certain aspects of what you might call a student misconduct affects actual decisions, looking at administrative data. When I looked at what I got on those DVDs, the call reports, and these are the logs of when parents call into a district and say something's wrong in the building where my kid is, and they start screaming, and then the police take it down and it gets put into a database. I compared that to what the school district was telling the state in the way of misconduct. And I wouldn't say they were orthogonal, but they were disparate universes. So there's a lot of noise in data that comes into a district, and arguably there may be noise in what a district sends to the state in terms of misconduct. And my three early RAs, Shelby, Tessa, and Rajiv, who were alums of the Pittsburgh Public Schools, were pretty upset at what they saw. Rajiv in particular, because he reported to me that across the street at Oliver High School years ago, a kid was shot dead, but it was never in any of the call reports. And just last week, as Channel 4 knows, the same thing happened. So there's school violence that's reported and there's school violence that isn't. And some of it in urban districts is pretty dangerous. The next sort of thing I did was to look across the country at every state's requirements for something called the Unsafe School Option, and then looked carefully at Philadelphia and Pittsburgh in terms of how school violence and poverty affected test scores. In that paper done in 2015, which I gave at AEFA, it was scheduled for Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. It was not a hot topic. It's out on the web and you can see it. So what I'm going to do today is revisit the misconduct issue, but for the whole state of Pennsylvania, virtually for every building over 20 years. And I want to look at this misconduct through the lens of No Child Left Behind. It's got a section called the Unsafe School Option. And I want to know whether buildings that are, quote, persistently dangerous or not, with the mandatory arrest requirement on top of duration and incidence rates, and I'll explain that. What does that look like? Is this a frequent or an infrequent event, and how many kids are involved? And then I want to ask the $64 question: if you don't require an arrest for there to be something bad happening in a school, fights, teachers getting beat up, stuff like that, how dangerous or undangerous are the schools? Okay, and then I want to look at that in terms of mean test scores, the level of student learning outcomes at the building level per year, and also the variability of student test scores, which is the coefficient of variation in scale scores, to see if arrests or incidents and poverty, how do they drive, what's the statistical relationship between these things and learning outcomes. And in effect, I'm asking the question, if a principal could reduce misconduct somehow, or reduce poverty somehow, what would happen to learning outcomes? So this is a play on what used to be called educational production functions. And then after I go through the findings in the working paper, Hanlu's going to go over and revisit some of the stuff, but with more powerful econometric techniques. In particular, she's going to investigate whether there's spatial correlation of scale scores, and then what are buildings like that have closed over time compared to those that persist. And then she's going to look at some correlates of scale scores to see how that affects test results. So section 2, the next section of this presentation, will explain some of the legal stuff. Section 3, I'll give you descriptive statistics over time for these roughly 3,000 buildings each year for 20 years in Pennsylvania. And then in section 4, I'm going to look at those districts which are the most unsafe. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh will get our attention. And then I'll do a brief overview of an exploratory regression model. And then Hanlu's going to pick up and deal with the extensions, and then you can ask questions and so forth. Okay, so what is the unsafe school choice option that was part of NCLB that was enacted? And by the way, even though NCLB was dramatically revised a couple of years ago, this thing is still in the law if you go read the US code. So this is current law, and it started about 2001. The unsafe school choice option has got 3 variables that have to be determined by each state. It's got to be reported by each state each year to the US Department of Education. And the first is how many school safety violations were there? And that decomposes into dangerous acts. You can think of violence of kids on kids or kids on staff, or weapons violations, kids found with guns, kids found with knives. So those are safety violations. And so the first question is, how many of them are there? The second variable is taking the first measurement result and then identifying whether there's a pattern. How many violations were there by size of school? And what's the rate of misconduct? In other words, the number of dangerous acts plus weapons divided by enrollment. And then how persistent, or what's the duration of the pattern? Is it last year or 2 of the 3 last years? And so if these 3 variables get to thresholds, then you wind up each year determining whether any building in a state is or is not persistently dangerous. And that's a term in the law. If it's persistently dangerous, NCLB safe school choice option requires that the parents be informed and that the parents may move a child to a safe school in that district if a safe school exists, okay? So that's the law, and you probably never heard about this, okay? And it's interesting if you think about the fact that you haven't heard about it, because this is like one of the pillars, just like making progress on an annual basis, okay? So this is the safety issue in NCLB. All right, so how heterogeneous are the definitions of school violence as of 2013 when I and my research assistant read every state plan and every state law, which is extremely tedious. So it turns out that only 10 states said that arson was a reportable incident, and they're listed there. 34 of the 50 states in the District of Columbia, 34 said that assaults were bad things and should be counted, and so forth. So you get an idea that weapons, 47, virtually all of the states counted weapons incidents, and 19 states counted violation of gun-free zones, which is actually a federal rule that came out of the US Department of Education. Robbery was countable in 24 states and sexual assault in 29. So this is sort of the general background of how heterogeneous or forgiving the Bush and Obama administrations were in allowing states to self-define what an unsafe situation was. Okay. Now, what about Pennsylvania, which we're going to focus on? Okay, so there's 3 steps. A school building in Pennsylvania in a given year is dangerous if the school building meets one of the following 3 conditions in conjunction with a duration test. For a small building, 250 kids or less, at least 5 dangerous incidents. But they can't just be incidents. The principal has to call the cops and the perpetrator has to be arrested, okay? So in Pennsylvania, we're one of 4 states that says there are incidents, but there has to also be an arrest for this to be something that could lead to a determination of persistently dangerous. For a middle-sized school between 251 and 1,000, it's got to be at least 2% of that school's enrollment. And for over 1,000 kids, it's got to be 20 or more dangerous incidents. Again, an arrest has to occur. Now, in terms of duration, Pennsylvania says if a building is persistently dangerous in 2 of the last 3 years, if a building is dangerous within the last 2 or 3 years, then it becomes persistently dangerous and the parent has the right to move his or her kid. Okay, so that's the Pennsylvania rule. That's what the US Department of Education accepted in the state plan. And so where did I get data on all this stuff that I'm going to report on? Well, basically, I made a bunch of right to know requests, which is the Pennsylvania statute, which obligates the state agency to provide information. And they gave me spreadsheets, sometimes quickly, sometimes not so quickly. And I'm looking only at public school buildings. So I'm not looking at charter units. I'm not looking at intermediate units, and I'm not looking at central offices. And I'm attributing kids to where they went to school, not where they took their test, because sometimes kids get moved around. Poverty is measured in the data that Pennsylvania collects and provides upon request, using a definition based on not only food stamps, but TANF and I believe Medicaid. And the reason that's important, as some of you may know, is that a lot of schools in the last 5 or 10 years, districts, have gone to free lunches, so there's no particular onus on whether a kid has a card or not. So this is a measure of family poverty, and they did this through matching of records. And the outcome that I'm looking at is at building and grade level, the scale score on math and language arts. So I'm looking at a number, not whether they're below basic, what have you. And the test scores in Pennsylvania, as about 30 other states, is due to something called data recognition, which is out of Minneapolis. And they're the big purveyor of data. So this graph shows for each of the study years, starting with 1999-2000 through 2018-19, 2 variables. The solid blue line is the number of arrests reported across all districts. And then the light blue line with the open circle is the number of incidents. Okay, and as you might expect, arrests are far less frequent, and they peaked out at around 10,000 in the years 2004 through 2009. And what's happened with incidents is that it went from about 40,000 up to around almost 80,000. Systematically declined. And then in the last 3 study years, it kind of went up a bit. Just to give you some comparisons, in year 2000, there would have been about 1.8 million kids. And by 2019, there were about 1.6 million kids. Okay, so that gives you sort of relative magnitudes. If you take the ratio of arrests to incidents, they've been falling like crazy from a peak in 2004 to almost 18%. And then they're now down to about 5%. So this gives you overall state patterns.
Do you have any idea, sorry to ask
Yeah.
a clarifying question, of kind of the whether the characteristics of the data changed rather than the actual incidents? Like, is there any reason to think that you somehow had differential reporting over this time?
Well, the definition of what's in the state plan was stable. Okay, number one. And number two, you can think of arrests being far more voluntary or subjective or willful by a local principal or superintendent because they know it's going to have an effect, right? But incidents reporting, I think, is relatively frequent and stable, and it carries no onus. So I'm making the assumption, Suzanne, I can't really prove it, your point's well taken, that the incidents are an indication of the underlying misconduct, okay? And in the regression analysis, I use dummy variables for time to try to hold some of this stuff constant.
Do you know
But-
why it went up so much in 2002? Is that something that's,
Well, that was the
Know those?
beginning. That was the beginning of the duration test. So I think that there was a lot of enthusiasm for getting tough. I think that attitudes and interventions have changed a lot over time. Okay, but I can tell you that if you talk to both the State Board of Education privately in Pennsylvania or any state, New York, I know has the same perspective, and principals, and the teachers union and the school boards association, they're extremely sensitive to safety reporting because it has dramatic effects on location decisions by parents and kids to the extent they have the option to move. And I could get into what I've seen in Pittsburgh because I've looked very, very closely. And just to give you a number about endogeneity, last year, and this is really for Channel 4, it's not been well reported, there were about 23,000 kids in the Pittsburgh public schools. Okay, this year, there are about 20,000. That's a 15% decline, Susanna. And it's not just the pandemic. The kind of violence you're going to see later on in my presentation is going to tell you that at the margin, if parents have a choice, they're getting the hell out. Okay. And I can tell you, I'm not going to make a secret of it. I have talked privately with at least 2 former presidents of the school board, and I have presented this to people inside the school district, and nobody wants to talk about it. I've even presented it to the foundation to provide a little support, but which requested anonymity because the findings are so startling. So stay tuned and let's take a look further, okay? So here are for every year, I calculate the distribution of the arrest rate. So imagine you've got about 3,000 buildings in a school year, and you ask the question, what's the ratio of arrests to enrollment for each building? Well, I start at the 75th percentile because it's 0 to the left of that distribution. And you can see that the arrest rate at the 75th percentile for 2010 and through after was 0. So that shows you that there's a lack of enthusiasm for reporting arrests, right? Especially if you think that arrests or the misconduct underlying it is relatively stationary. And then if you go out to the right of the distribution to the 90th percentile, you can see that overall, the 90th percentile was 4.5% arrest rate. So the way to interpret that is, on average, for buildings at the 99th percentile in the spoke or above, there's 500 districts, 3,000 buildings. For the most violent buildings, the arrest rate was 4.5%, right? But if you look at the maximum, there's a building in 2006 where there are more arrests than enrollment, okay? And so there's some stuff going on in buildings around the state. And you see arrest rates for the highest, 22%, 17%. And overall, it's really startling to think that there are buildings where 10 or 15% of the kids in a given year are going to wind up getting arrested. Now, whether they're the same kids or not is something I can't answer in this table, but it gives you an idea that at the extreme, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. At least as a parent of kids, I would say there's bad stuff going on. Okay, this table looks, instead of at arrests, it looks at incidents. And so what you see is that at the median overall, the incident rate was about 1%. So that's the violence and that's the weapons being reported, but not taking into account arrests. And that if you go out to the extreme, you can see that there are buildings that had 115% of the kids involved in an incident, as much as 10 times that, or even 14 times that, okay? So there's some extreme stuff out there in some buildings where there's a lot of violence and weapons incidents.
So
Okay,
can I ask a quick question about some of those results? I'm just wondering what the denominator looks like on
it's
those.
the enrollment. It's the enrollment. So
But it's at the building level. So I'm just wondering if the extreme values could be driven by, very small specialized programs.
This table is going to weight by enrollment, okay? So stay tuned, okay? You're asking whether these small or big buildings. I understand. So just let me go and I'll answer your question. So this shows you what fraction of the buildings, think of it roughly as 3,000, the very first column there, persistently dangerous. So that means that 2 of the last 3 years, 2% more, that kind of stuff we went through. And overall, I'm finding that 4.1% of the buildings were persistently dangerous in Pennsylvania. Now that's including the arrest requirement, okay? Now what you're asking is, what if you weight by enrollment? Because maybe these are small buildings. So the answer is, it almost doubles. The weighted average is like 7.3%, okay? Now, you can't find these data in any report persistently dangerous from the state of Pennsylvania to the federal government because it's not reported. But you can find it in Inspector General's report for Philadelphia. But my numbers and their numbers are in different universes, okay? But the last 2 columns are really startling, and that's the takeaway of the paper. Suppose that we remove the arrest requirement and we redo the simulation. That as we look at this 2 of the last 3 years, and what's the incident rate, okay? And so now we find that 36.9% of the buildings are persistently dangerous in terms of incidents, but not looking at arrests. And if you weight it by enrollment, you're at 46.7% of the kids, okay? So this tells you, it tells me that if you believe that the incidents are reasonable measures of misconduct, there are a lot of kids at risk, okay? And it's not necessarily a place where you want your kid, whether you're rich or poor or whatever, to be in school. Because if schools have lots of misconduct going on, it's hard to believe that learning takes place, okay? So Jesse, I think I've answered your question in part, right? You may not like the result, but that's what the data tells us. Okay. Next, I want to focus on, if you take districts, not buildings, and you ask the question, who's got the largest share of total arrest incidents in terms of the 20-year panel, the top 20 districts have most of what's going on in terms of arrests. And by contrast, if you add up their enrollments, it's very concentrated, okay? So there's some districts with trouble. That's what this says. And we'll get to which ones there are. And if you look at incidents instead of arrests, it's more disparate. It's more spread out, but it's still very concentrated. And the ratio of share of incidents to share of enrollment, you can think of it as kind of like a Gini curve, right? Because it's, it's sort of 2 distributions. Okay, so who are they? And now I'm naming names, and Channel 4 is looking and sees that Philadelphia has over the 20 years, 45% of the arrests in the state. And they've got 128,000 kids in 2018-19 out of 1.5 million. So they have far bigger share of arrests than they have share of kids. And Pittsburgh, with 22,000, has 10%, but still, both of those numbers are disproportionate, okay? If you look at incidents, you find that Erie has 10.4% of the incidents in the state over a 20-year period. Philadelphia has 20% of the incidents, and Pittsburgh has 41% of the incidents. So all of a sudden, Pittsburgh looks very, very different than the commonly held view within southwestern Pennsylvania of being a relatively stable, happy, safe public school system, okay? And that's a very interesting finding. Okay, so now let's look at Philadelphia and Pittsburgh per year very carefully. And so this table and the next one are just like the ones for statewide. And the very first column shows for Philadelphia, what fraction of their buildings were persistently dangerous each year. And overall, the answer is 13%. And if you look at from 2014 down to 2018, it looks like things are getting better, right? The fraction of buildings that are persistently dangerous using arrests as your criteria has plummeted. On the other hand, if you Google and look at what the Philadelphia Inquirer found, they found there was massive underreporting, which is your point, Susanna, right? There could be endogeneity. Okay, and if you weight the first column by enrollment, you get the same result. But here is kind of an answer to your question, Susanna, because we're holding district constant, right? And so if you use incidents instead of arrests, you find that Philadelphia had 59, 64, 68% of its buildings persistently dangerous. And if you weight by enrollment, it's extremely high, 78, 83, overall on average 90%, okay? And that's a scary set of numbers, right? Now, I don't know if any of you have ever taught in the Philadelphia schools or know about it, but it's not a happy district. And they're looking for a superintendent, by the way, who's been there 10 years.
Jesse, does this get at what you were asking?
Say again?
I was just following up with Jesse to see if that helped.
No, I mean, I think I understand the big picture message. I just was concerned that some of those order statistics might be inflated by fluctuations and small denominators when you look at things like the maximum. It was more a statistical question, but I'm not sure that, other than some, making sure we understand kind of like how, the reporting issues around what kind of things get reported in different places and how that's mediated by the, teachers. I think it doesn't change anything about the overall message.
Yeah, well, the last two columns, I think, tell a very different story than the first two columns. And I think we can all agree that arrest is a discretionary thing for the principal and the assistant principal who's got to call the cops or not. Be the cops, be the school cops or the municipal police. Okay, so you say, okay, what about Pittsburgh? I think you can read this. I can make it bigger if you can't. I thought Susanna was squinting. Is that better?
Can I ask a question or should I save it for later?
Well, go for it. I mean, let's.
I guess one part is when you think about the statistics of the reports of incidents versus arrests, how does that align to local statistics around crime related to that? But then the second question is, did you find any correlation between poverty and the—
That's coming. That's coming in the regression stuff, okay?
Okay.
There's also one other question I have about the incident reporting. There is some research that suggests that Philadelphia had created sort of deeper nets for what constitutes violation. And so if Dakota Irby at University of Illinois, Chicago has looked over time at how they were identifying incidents and the ways in which those incidents became broader in terms of what constituted incidents and deeper in terms of the sort of punitive nature of the discipline policies. So I think one thing that strikes me is that where people look and how people identify incidents is not an objective process, that there's subjectivity, there's subjective judgment in some of those processes. So just to keep in mind that the way in which, you know, this sort of dovetails with mass incarceration and other processes is also relevant to the overall discussion. But, you know, just a thought around incidents and arrest in the context we're talking about, where people look for incidents, they're likely to find more.
Well, Hanlu's going to provide some more detailed stuff, and I'll be happy if you could email me the citation. I'd like to look at it because I'm not familiar with the paper. Okay, all right, let's look at Pittsburgh for a second. And on the left side, the very first column, what you see is for each year, how a fraction of the buildings that are persistently dangerous. And overall, it's 7.9%. And if you weight by enrollment, it's 12. But if you look at incidents as reported to the state, and you get a very different story. You get overall 84% of the buildings are persistently dangerous. And then if you weight by enrollment, you get to 89.5%. So these two views of the world compared to this are very different, okay? And it's you know, like orders of magnitude higher. And you know, this is what gets reported to the state. The state doesn't make it very public, but that's what goes forward. Okay, now let me.
One other question, Mr. I don't remember the specific lawsuit, but there was a lawsuit at one point in Pittsburgh that was pivotal in them addressing equity, and where I think they reached a final verdict or whatever it was on that lawsuit that may have impacted drop off on. Do you know if that had any impact on that drop off of numbers that you see around 2005 or 6 for Pittsburgh, where they were kind of forced to focus on equity, suspensions, the students that were in gifted programs, how they were addressing those particular?
Yeah, well, and even more recently, about 2017, a different superintendent did restorative justice, and he claimed that it improved things. Okay, but I'll go back and try. I mean, I'm in touch with career people who've been there a long time inside the district and see what the litigation was and so forth. Okay. All right, so let me turn to the regression stuff because I've talked too much, and Hanlu's got stuff that's very, very interesting too. It looks like I've stimulated a bunch of talk. So now we go from sort of describing misconduct in the buildings to see what does it mean for learning outcomes, okay? Is there a relationship? And what I'm looking at is a building each year by grade level. And I've got two simple hypotheses. One is that as household poverty goes up, scale scores go down, and also the coefficient of variation in scale scores goes up. And second, as misconduct goes up, scale scores go down, and the coefficient of variation in scale scores goes up. And so trying to explain scale scores on the basis of poverty and misconduct is complicated by the common sense observation that there's some relationship between poverty and misconduct and poverty, okay? And a problem I have working with the universe of buildings over time is that I don't have as much detailed data as I would like to create a structural model that takes cause and effect into account. So there are other things that are going on over time. And this may get back to you, Jennifer. The tests have changed over time in Pennsylvania, okay? The PSSA is not a stable thing. The content knowledge, the anchors, the way teachers are trained, over a 20-year period, there's been a lot of change. And so I'm trying to take into account some of this by using dummy time variables. And to take into recognition the fact that poverty and misconduct affect each other, I create an interaction term. So my regression model is that the mean building scale score for a year depends on the poverty rate, the misconduct rate, and then the interaction of poverty and school misconduct together. The type of test, whether it's math or reading, the grade level, and then the year. Okay, and I'm going to use ordinary least squares. Okay, this is descriptive statistics. Let's keep going because we're running late. If we use the arrest rate to explain test scores, and we use the poverty rate, here's what we see. The background or intercept level of test score is 1350, which is very close to the mean. And it's got a tiny standard error. It's very significant. As the poverty rate goes up, mean test scores go down. That's extremely significant. And as the arrest rate goes up, test scores go down. Okay, so what this says is in a given year, if the arrest rate is high, it's not deterring anything. There's stuff going on in the building, unhappiness, what have you, okay? And then the interaction term is actually positive. And if you add these two coefficients together, they're bigger than this positive. So what this tells you is that the effect of poverty and the effect of misconduct is measured by the arrest rate, even taking into account the interaction, are going to depress scale scores. And the T is very high, it's 15.7. And the R square is about 0.58. So the model, with about 75,000 observations, does rather well, 78,964 actually. And you get this inverse relationship, which is confirmatory to the hypothesis. If you change the misconduct measure from arrest to incident, what you find is, again, this inverse relationship, and it's larger, the T is large, you get about the same R squared. So this is some confirmation that if a principal has control over incidence rates and poverty rates, he can lower the incident rate of misconduct and reduce the poverty rate, maybe through the refundable child care credit. We expect there to be improved outcomes in terms of test scores, scale scores, okay? Now, there's some other stuff, but I'm going to stop at this point because it's 10:02, and I want Hanlu to pick up because she's got some very interesting results. So let me get to her part of the presentation. And are you there still?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Strauss. I'm currently taking Professor Strauss' course, Education Policy, this semester. And several weeks ago, he asked us to read this working paper. There seems to be some more things to do in it. So I asked Professor Strauss to join the project, and she said that it was okay. So I will discuss the exploratory work we did the last couple of weeks. It's been pretty interesting. I will present my result in the following parts. First, I will explain a spatial regression and our motivation to use the tool. Then I will compare the results from the spatial regression and ordinary least regress. Next, I will talk about the life cycle of school buildings. And finally, I will present correlation of test scores in terms of different types of misconduct to see what kind of misconduct is associated with lower learning outcomes. Next, please. First, why think about using spatial regression? So OLS assumes that the error term is independent from other error terms across locations. This means in a cross-section, location doesn't matter. Well, in the context of where parents send their kids to school, this may not be reasonable. There is something called the Moran test for spatial correlation of residuals, and the Moran test checks for this assumption. To do this test, one needs the location, longitude and latitude of each school building, which was in the dataset, fortunately. And most happily, Stata 17 allows one to correct for spatial correlation and spatial autocorrelation using data sets with spatial units. That saved me a lot of work. The spatial correlation model allows outcomes in one area to be affected by outcomes, covariates, and errors from nearby areas. The model also accepts panel data, but the data need to be strongly balanced, which means each school must remain in the sample for all years. We found that Pennsylvania school buildings don't always reflect this pattern. So we did spatial regression by year, grade, and test tab, then compared with OLS result by year, grade, and test tab. That is, we did cross-sectional analysis. Next, please. Before running the spatial correlation, we did the Moran test, which checks whether observations mean score are independent geographically. So null hypothesis here is that observations are independent. The graph below shows that only in 2011 was the null hypothesis accepted at 95% significant level for grade 8. So we would conclude that by and large, the test scores are correlated geographically at the moment in time, which means that in the cross-section, we need to account for it or get biased results. And the next question we ask is whether or not this effect is big or small numerically. To answer this, we estimate spatial regression and construct some racial outcomes variables to compare results from spatial regression and OLS. Next, please. This slide explains how the ratios are generated. Let Y be the mean score, let X1 be the incident rate, and X2 be the poverty rate. Equation 1 represents the spatial regression, and equation 1A is represent the OLS version. We take the estimated results from equation 1 and use the mean of X1 and X2 to predict the mean of Y, and do the same for equation 1A. So ratio is defined as the predicted spatial mean test score divided by predicted mean test score from the OLS as the mean of X1 and mean of X2. If there were no spatial correlation, the ratio would be constant 1. But we already know from the Moran test that there is spatial correlations. We also calculate the marginal effect to see how each variable affects the results. Equation 2 is the first derivative of Y with respect to X1, and the next question is the first derivative of Y with respect to X2. Using the estimated coefficients from spatial and OLS regression, we can then examine the predicted marginal effects of either X1 going slightly up or X2 going slightly up. Since there is an interaction term in the initial specification, the marginal effect of X1 wins up depending on the estimated effect of X1 on Y and the level of the other variable X2 and the estimated coefficients. We will use the mean of X2 for this numerical calculation. One way to think about looking at the marginal effects of X1 and X2 is to think about the school principal, who is to do something about through policy to change the incident rate or poverty rate. Recall that in the working paper, the idea of changing X2 as a poverty rate for kids in a building would result from the refundable child care credit, reducing the poverty rate by 50%. So what do we find when we compare the total effects of X1 and X2 when spatial correlation is corrected for compared to OLS? And what do we find for the marginal effects of X1 on Y and for X2 on Y? Let's look at some plots of the ratio by year. Next, please. This plot compares the prediction of rating scores using two models. If the ratio is constant at 1, which means there are no neighborhood effects on mean scores, we know that this is not the case already from the Moran test. The ratio by grade level has some variability here, indicating that scores in one school building are affected by other buildings nearby, holding constant year and grade. According to the graph, in most years, compared with the spatial regression results, OLS underestimated score of grade 5 and overestimated the score for grade 8 and 11. In addition, grade 11 seems to have larger geographical effects in the other two grades. Note that the difference are not too big, which are around 2%. Next, please. This plot shows the comparison of prediction on math scores, which has a similar trend with the rating scores. Next, please. Here we compare the marginal effects of the incident rate on rating scores from the two regression results. If the ratio is above 1, it means the effect of incidence rate are underestimated by OLS, and it is overestimated by OLS if the ratio is below 1. The graph shows that for most of the years, OLS underestimated in grade 5, while OLS underestimated in grade 8 and 11. Note that the range of difference is much larger, about -20% to 20%, which we also notice that in recent years, the OLS effects underestimate in all grades. Next, please. The comparison on the math score illustrates the same pattern. Next, please. Now let's look at the marginal effects on the poverty rate on mean reading test scores. It shows a reverse pattern than the incident rates. In most years, the poverty rate is the effects of poverty rate is underestimated for grade 8 and 11, while it's overestimated for grade 5. The range of difference is about -5% to +15%. Next, please.
So can I just ask a quick question? In the OLS, did you have building effects in there? Building
No.
fixed effects?
No.
So you just had, so it was just cross-sectional, but over time?
Yes, over time and grade.
Was Susanna, are you asking about the regression in the working paper or what Hanlu just reports?
What you had reported when you said this is the relationship between test scores and the incidences or the arrests, were those are just cross-sectional?
Let's go back. In the working paper, it's a model of data over time with the 2 explanatory variables and the interaction, and then a dummy variable for time. But there's no fixed effect for building.
Okay.
Okay.
Why?
I was trying to keep it simple. When you do fixed effects across an entire state, one of the things you find is that the fixed effects coefficients of buildings are more interesting than you could possibly imagine. They're huge and nobody talks about it. Okay, so what I tried to do in the working paper was, here are things that people think about in the older literature. Here's a first cut. Okay. And what we're trying to do, what Hanlu's trying to do, is start to unravel the onion very, very slowly. Because if you tell me that you've got a building effect, the building effect can swamp everything, because it's a combination of socioeconomics, resources, what have you. And I'm trying to sort of tease it out and unravel the onion to begin with. And I've done fixed effects. But when I start looking at particular buildings, and the ones that you see from the percentile distributions in the earlier part of the paper, they're off the chart, just as you would expect. And it confirms one's intuition that some buildings are very, very difficult. And wait till you see what Hanlu did when we looked at closures, because that's really going to be interesting.
Okay.
All right. All right. So I'm sorry, pick up, Hanlu. We've got a lot of interest, which is a good thing.
So let's look back to the marginal effects of the poverty rate on the mean reading test scores. It shows a reverse pattern than the incident rate, and the range of difference about -5% to 15%. And next, please. And this one shows the marginal effects of poverty rate on math scores. Here, in all cases, the effects are underestimated in OLS regression. So we are finding that location matters, and OLS can overall underestimate total effects by a little, but marginal effects show greater variability. Therefore, in the future, we hope to investigate this difference and figure out the mechanism of neighborhood effects. And next, I want to take a look at the school buildings themselves. We notice that some buildings drop out from the sample and some join the sample. This can occur for lots of reasons, but are there any observable difference in the test scores of buildings which go out of the business? Next, please. So we calculate the number of school closure with years and grades. Here is a school closure is defined if the building is not operated in the next year. So x-axis is the year and y-axis is the number of closing buildings. The result indicates that every year some school buildings were closed, and elementary school seems to have more closures than middle school or high schools, which makes sense. We also noticed there's a spike in 2006 and 2007, In the future work, we'll examine deeper to check what happened this year. But what about the mean test score results in the buildings? And what about incident rate and poverty rate of buildings that get closed next year compared with those which persist next year? Answering this question is a little bit tricky, but with a bit of R programming, a closure variable can be constructed. With such a classification variable, we did a t-test on whether the means of the building that closed are different than the means of those who continue to operate next year. Next, please.
So what, sorry, what did we get out of that slide?
So this slide just show a simple trend of the closing number of schools. So by year, like in a year, each year there's some closing schools, like middle school or elementary school, and since that elementary school has more closures since like in the middle and high school, which makes sense. And also we noticed there's a spike in 2006 and 2007. We haven't got time to look into a year to see what happened that year, but in the future work, we will check what exactly caused the abnormal spike there.
I'm just wondering, as you're thinking about, I guess that for future studies, were there any things like the Fresh Starts era or the not necessarily No Child Left Behind, but where they were looking at those school improvement efforts, closing and merging schools, if that's a time period where that policy had an impact that happened along the same time?
Okay, so let me respond, Jennifer, with a suspicion. Okay, suppose you're a superintendent in a school district and you're not making adequate yearly progress in a building, which happens, right? If you go out and talk to people privately, what you find is that mergers and changing the grade levels in a building is a way to interrupt the measurement process so that NCLB money doesn't get interrupted. Okay. And what I want you to do now is look carefully, and Hanlu is going to explain something about buildings that closed.
Okay, so here's the t-test result. So the result is surprisingly that the mean score of closing building is about 200 scores points, lower than that of buildings which remain open. So the number is close to the deviation of the mean score of the whole data set. And the result also indicates that the closed building tend to have higher incident rate and higher poverty rate. All results are statistically significant. And this comparison told us that something are concealed by closing a building.
Okay, so what motivates this, Jennifer, is like an open question, right? But what we're seeing is that over 20 years with building level data in Pennsylvania, the buildings that got closed were ones who scored lower on the PSSA by 200 points, which is a standard deviation. They had higher incident rates of misconduct and much higher poverty rates, okay? So
Is that a standard deviation for students or for buildings?
the 193 is the standard deviation of a mean scale score of kids in a building.
Of kids, so huge differences, because across schools, that's a real, schools have a very much smaller standard deviation.
Well, you know, what we're looking at is the mean test score in a building. Okay. And so this tells us something, okay? It's beginning to unravel the onion. And you can ask yourself, if kids if disadvantaged kids are in buildings that get closed, then where are they going? Okay, and I happen to know Philadelphia, and I know Congressman Dwight Evans, and in Philadelphia, they created about 60 charter schools, and the kids went there, okay? So there's egress of various kinds. In a sense, there's an equilibrium going on, and we're beginning to see a little bit of it. And I haven't seen anybody model this, and this is like a diagnostic, okay? And it's 20 years of data in every public school building in the state. It's not just a little piece of the puzzle. It's the whole story. I'm sorry, Hanlu, let's keep going.
Yeah, so the table shows that there's something concealed by closed building. And previous results all told us that the misconduct has a significant effect on students' academic outcomes. And in Professor Strauss' previous work, different misconducts are not differentiated. So violence violations are treated as the same as a weapon violation. The underlying misconduct data is quite rich, so we decided to explore how different kinds of misconduct are related to the mean score scores. Next, please. Here is a correlation table of mean scores and different types of misconduct. The staff assault rate is calculated by dividing number of times a student assault a teacher by the total number of teachers in the building for a given year. And the student assault rate is the number of times a student assault another student divided by total enrollment in the building. And knife rates are number of cases when a student is caught with possession of a knife divided by the total enrollment in the building in a year. And the pupil-teacher ratio is the number of students assigned to one teacher. Each of these variables has different but negative relationship with the mean scores. And then we run a simple OLS regression, use these variables. Next, please. So now we only have 16,000 observations on building in years because the detailed misconduct information has only been collected for limited number of years. So R square is around 60%. With grade and year as dummy variables, each kind of misconduct and student-teacher ratio have a negative effect on the mean test scores. And our results are statistically significant. So in the future, we'll continue to work on this to construct more complex structured model, which help with identification problem. And obviously, we want to estimate such model in spatial regression analysis and compare results to OLS. So these are the new findings from the last couple of weeks of exploration, which has been interesting for me. And I will give back to Professor Strauss.
Okay, so questions and comments.